validity, are you measuring what you think you're measuring? What is the accuracy? Reliability, does it do it consistently? Whether it's right or wrong, the number could be inaccurate, it could be accurate, but does it repeatedly give you the same result?
We're back. Welcome to VALDCAST. Tyler Collings, welcome on the show.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. We're here at Vald HQ. It's the week of ValdCon. It's not your first time in the building, but it's certainly a lot more packed than you're used to.
Yeah. I mean, ValdCon is always the busiest week of the year here at Vald, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. It's massive. I think this year's the biggest attendance we've had from overseas, and all of our staff coming together. It's a special week for sure. But it's not your first time in the building. It's not your first time being associated with Vald as well. So I'm sure it's a surreal thing for you to see this amount of people here as well.
Yeah, I think I've probably been coming here to Vald HQ since around 2019.
Yeah.
And every time I come into this place, they've knocked down another wall, bought another building, and expanded the place out. And it's crazy to see how much has changed over that.
And we're still struggling for space as well, even at that. Yeah. Cool. So you're based in the Gold Coast, is that right?
Yep, that's right. Griffith University, Gold Coast.
What are we looking at? A 1 hour commute to get up here?
Just short of that this morning.
Oh, okay, not too bad. That's good. So what I want to jump into today is validation, and in general. There's obviously we'll touch on some specific papers that have came out recently, but from the perspective of someone in the field of biomechanics and as a researcher at the university level, I want to open up with just like what, in your words and in your definition, is reliability and validity? Because at Vald, it's probably one of the most asked questions that we get around our technology when we're in conversations around potentially other technologies as well. People want to know, is it reliable? Is it valid? But definitionally speaking, what is that?
Yeah, sure. So validity, are you measuring what you think you're measuring? What is the accuracy? There's a few different types of validity. You can look at validity in terms of comparing to some current standard or some sort of ground truth. So is the device measuring what you think it's measuring, and is it doing that accurately? Reliability, does it do it consistently? Whether it's right or wrong, the number could be inaccurate, it could be accurate, but does it repeatedly give you the same result? And reliability is another aspect which has multiple components to it as well, right? Yeah. You have trial to trial variability that comes from normal human variability and movement and force production. And then you'll have fluctuation between days. So you'll have between day reliability. And a component of that will be the device, and some of it will be the user, and some of it will be the athlete. And you really can't separate all three of those components of reliability.
Yeah, for sure. I think in the context of Vald, like a lot of our clientele are in the performance space, or even in the health space. They're athletes. They're going along a rehab journey, or they're readiness testing. So you're never going to have the athlete in the exact same state Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So if you do that, there's lots of human elements I think we need to rely on or consider, I guess, when we're looking at validation. But are there any misconceptions that you've seen so far around validation?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to validation, it's usually depends, what are you treating as your ground truth measure that you're comparing to?
Yeah.
Is it, you're measuring force? Is it that you're measuring force that's validated with the device is actually giving you the correct, reading in newtons?
Yeah.
That's the base thing you want to know. Second to that, you'll see validation done where it's compared to some other standard, and that validation is only really as good as what you're comparing to. And is that some sort of laboratory equipment? Is it really validation to compare one strength testing device to another?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, that could just be the difference between two setups, and it's not necessarily validation of a device against the ground truth of something that we're confident is the absolute best measure that could possibly be done.
Yeah.
And you'll quite often see validation studies done where they're not compared to what we would consider a gold standard or a ground truth measure.
Yeah, I think the term gold standard gets lost in the weeds as well sometimes. We talk about, like I've mentioned my own PhD journey, I'm looking at speed data, and we'll use our gold standard as a high-speed camera. We look at something like force plates. It's a bit tricky to understand what is the gold standard. If you're just comparing one set of force plates to another, Is it really the gold standard? It's a bit messy when you get into that.
Yeah, gold standard is subjective in a way, and quite often what's accepted is different to what is gold standard. Gold standard under what budget? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's very much the case, isn't it?
100%. Yeah, no, I think that leads me nicely into some of the papers that we're going to talk about today, and you've been involved as the lead author in the forced X validation paper, which I'll start with. If you want to just talk us through the study design of that, how you went about it, and maybe a quick rundown of the results for any of the listeners that haven't read that paper yet.
Yeah, sure. So the study design there was we wanted to compare against the laboratory equipment, right? That was what we considered to be gold standard. Was if you're measuring ground reaction forces with a laboratory equipment, how does that compare to the force sticks? So we know that the force sticks get validated in-house when they're made, right? We know that they measure force accurately, like load cells technology is accurate. But if you were to be doing these tests on a force sticks versus your laboratory force plates, how would the force measures differ? And more interestingly, that was around the time the center of pressure metrics got released on the force sticks. So we compared both vertical ground reaction forces and center of pressures compared between the force sticks. And underneath the force sticks, we had laboratory force plates measuring forces in 3 dimensions, but we were only interested in the vertical component of that.
They were AMTI plates?
And they were, yeah, AMTI. And the other part to that was that there really wasn't a definitive source of validity and reliability data across a whole spectrum of tests. Someone does counter movement jumps and they'll do the reliability study. And then someone else is interested in balance, so they'll do the balance test. So we just wanted to do a consistent methodology across as many different test types as we could. So we did jump tests, we did isometric mid-thigh pulls, balance tests, squat tests, and evaluated the concurrent validity. So concurrent meaning that the force was measured at the exact same time. That's another mistake that people make, is they might measure at one time point and then switch the device and measure at another time point. But because of human movement variability, those two measures, you wouldn't expect them to be the same, right? You'd expect them to slightly differ.
So when you talk about concurrent, if you frame that for the listeners, that is placing the force stacks on top of the AMTI plates.
Yeah. So in this situation, it's kind of the best you can do with concurrent, with force plates, is to place them on top of each other. Because it's a rigid structure, it should, or as close as you get to rigid, the force you measure at the ground and the vertical should be the same as the vertical and above it. Provided
you get the zeroing right and everything in that regard,
exactly. So make sure force plates are both reading 0 when stacked. And yeah, across the validity, the accuracy and the center of pressure was really good. Around on average less than 2 millimeters difference between the force plates. We looked at the force time trace, not just the metrics, but the entire force time trace, and on average, you're looking at there at a few up to 5 newtons of force of difference, which can almost be explained away entirely by just the differences in the readings between the two force plates. When you do get an impact on the force plate in particular when jumping and landing, it just creates a little bit of artifact between the two devices.
For sure.
And so it's almost within a negligible amount of error that you might expect with that setup.
Okay, interesting for sure. And I guess when we look at the specific performance of metrics, were there some metrics that were, let's just say, within the 90% range, and then some that were 100%, or what did that look like?
Yeah, you'll generally find any metric that has got quite a large magnitude to it. So peak forces, right? Peak forces, highly accurate, highly reliable. Anything that has a very small magnitude to it. So, the timing of a movement phase, which is then used for things like rate of force development, that starts to increase the amount of variability. Because if you can just imagine that just a small deviation in the timing creates a really large deviation in the overall number.
For sure.
So when you're looking at things like, center of pressure movement, especially if it's something like a quiet stance, there's very little variability in that as a task. So therefore you see lower levels of reliability. But for anything that is, peak forces and impulses, high magnitude, you generally see really high levels of reliability.
Perfect. I think that's a useful thing to point out as well, that the start of movement is so crucial when you talk about any of those time constrained metrics. If it is eccentric RFD, or if it anything that, if you imagine someone starts milliseconds later or milliseconds earlier, it's going to significantly skew the comparison of those metrics. So making sure that is nailed is crucial. And I guess my question on that is, how did you guys ensure that what you were measuring on the laboratory plates versus the force decks was truly concurrent, was the same start of movement? How did you go about that?
Yeah. So to make sure that we were comparing something consistent, do you imagine we have force time traces from both devices? Then if we use cross correlations, basically just overlaying the two force time traces and minimizing the difference between the two. And then that allows you to use the same time signature across both waveforms, so that you're getting consistent identification of start and stop events.
Yep.
And then that just allows you to extract out metrics that you know are going to be consistent.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's just to ensure that, you're doing a fair comparison between, it's not apples and oranges, it's apples to apples. And that's really what we're interested in doing.
Yeah, I think on that point, like I've part of my job, I read research papers and validation papers on the daily at this stage. When we look at other research that's out there in the industry, force plates, but then also just other sports technology tools, was there anything that you took from that to inform the study design of this, or any shortcomings that you identified in previous papers from years gone by?
I mean, there's obviously reliability studies for these kind of devices. If it's something that goes back a long time in the sports science literature. I think predominantly around how you approach the analysis of it, more so than the setup of the experimental design. How do you quantify variability within trials, right? Like coefficients of variation are highly interpretable. So that was something we drew on, and ICCs are sort of expected in the scientific literature, and the cutoffs for those are so well established. So, we obviously wanted to make sure we presented those, and then minimal detectable changes we know really matter to people on the ground who are doing interventions and wanting to measure pre-training to post-training. So I mean, we probably took a lot on more the statistical analysis of quantifying reliability and validity to make sure that whoever picked that up found the information they wanted from the paper to inform what they were doing.
Perfect. And then I guess if we'll continue to talk about papers there, if we maybe laterally shift to the dynamo. I know you had a paper that was validating the dynamo in certain contexts. If you could touch on that as well, that would be great.
Yeah, so more recently, we looked at the reliability of dynamo. We also did a comparison for the isometric mid-thigh pull because this was around the time Dynamo Max came out, right? So the idea was that that's really useful for high force testing. That's what it was designed for. So we were interested in looking at a comparison between the Dynamo Max for isometric mid-thigh pulls versus the force decks. Like we were talking about earlier, it's kind of an example of, it's not real validity, but it's this is a current standard for testing, and here's an alternative. How do the two compare? Can you use them interchangeably? Are there differences? And we did the same with handheld grip strength, comparing to a JMAR device, which is probably one of the most widely used devices and has sort of traditionally in the
gold standard.
Yeah, so it was just another. And once again, not sure gold standard, but an accepted standard. And so we did that comparison. We looked at the reliability of those devices. Shout out to Ben Goodlich, was Dr. Ben Goodlich now, who led the data collection on that one, and I sort of took the lead on the analysis of it.
Perfect. So on that, when you look at the IMTP specifically with force techs, you said that the question was, can we use these interchangeably? And I guess the question back to you is, can we?
There is consistency in the measure with some amount of offset in that. And I think off the top of my head, it might have been about a 15 Newton offset.
Okay.
If you think an isometric if I pull my average, 700, 800,000 plus Newtons. So it's a relatively small, but it's a consistent offset.
Yeah, and I guess, like, again, for the people listening, the key difference between the Dynamo Max is there's no element of body weight involved in that, whereas force plates, you need to weigh the individual beforehand. So when we look at metrics, it's going to be net peak vertical force and not peak vertical force on the force decks to look at your maximal force on dynamo.
Yeah, exactly. And the weighing is going to interfere with the scoring. So yeah, that's true.
For sure. There's a lot of resources out there now from Vol just to make sure that we nail the test before the test almost, which is the weighing phase. If we mess that up or we mess up the zeroing, you're going to have a knock-on effect that gets exponentially worse over time. So that's really important.
Yeah.
Amazing. So I guess when we talk about we've mentioned like the lab standard and the laboratory force plate, it's quite artificial in many ways. You're in a laboratory and this technology, force decks and dynamo, typically is not used in a laboratory, for its biggest use cases. It's with a performance setting. It's in a professional team. It could be in an allied healthcare clinic. So how do we translate what you found in the laboratory setting, the clean, sterile, controllable setting to the real world? What advice would you give practitioners when they're using this technology out there?
Yeah. Well, on the study design point of view, that was something we were aware of when we did these studies, right? And we had these discussions about, well, should we bring in the participants and do familiarization sessions, and should we make sure that they are, completely familiar with the test? And we actually made a lot of decisions in the experimental design to not do those things, to make it more like the real world, because we're aware that a lot of ForceX users are recording data with people who they've just moments before taught how to do the movement, right? So we deliberately didn't make it a full sterile environment, and we kept the number of trials and the practice trials to a reasonable number, like you would in the real world. The instructions were exactly the same as the real world, so we tried to get it as close to those kind of conditions as we could. But in terms of the maximizing reliability and validity of any device, it does come down to the operator and to a large degree. We in piloting, we noticed that even through the way you instruct things, obviously how you set up the equipment, how you position it, all of these things have probably the biggest impact on the quality of the data. So it really speaks to making sure that you are following the best kind of guidelines you can for the question of data. That's probably going to matter more than anything else for reliability and validity.
Completely agree. That's something I would stress just tenfold, that get your protocols right, get your setup right, and don't change things if you don't have to. So especially in the world of like portable force plates, it's very tempting to move them around the gym and move to certain areas, but where possible, I would at least recommend to find a spot where they live and keep that test, retest mindset in mind for sure. Amazing.
Yeah, I agree.
So I guess the final line of question here is, when an individual reads a research or validation paper, it's very common for a company like Vald or other companies to send their research, their reliability and validity data or resources across. What should someone be looking for in a validation paper? Because it's very easy to get lost in all that.
Yeah. Personally, I'm very sort of data, just science driven, and so that's the first place I usually look. I'm looking straight at the results, and I'm looking at what information they're giving. Is it fully transparent in the individual data, the summary of the means from each day, and the range of the variation in the data. Are they quantifying it with very transparent coefficient of variations and ICCs and these types of accepted metrics? Or is the analysis some very obscured niche way of analyzing your data to make their conclusion? And then you start to go, well, why did you need to sort of fit a more complex model and adjusting for things that might have its place, but only if you've sort of ticked off the very fundamental reporting of the data. Then you might move to something more complicated. So I'm always suspicious of any validity or reliability paper that skips the fundamentals and goes straight to a convoluted analysis and then just concludes, the reliability was great, trust us. I'm actually not, I wouldn't read the discussion too hard or the conclusion on a validity or reliability paper. I'd go straight to the results and look at the numbers and then make your own call on it. Authors are always going to spin it whatever way they want to spin it.
For sure.
The numbers speak for themselves.
So on the topic of transparency there, You've made the data transparent for the Force-X studies. Is that correct?
Yeah, for the Force-X study, for sure, I tried to make a resource it's through GitHub. It's a document where you can scroll through every test that we analyzed and look at the force time traces. Individual data is all there. All of the metrics you potentially need for reliability and validity are there.
Yeah.
And that was more just from the point of view of in a manuscript, when you submit to a journal, as you know, it's limited space and limited scope. But really, we wanted to create a resource that any practitioner could pick up and go find the metrics they want for the tests they want. And with hundreds of metrics that come out of the Force-X,
Yeah.
we knew that we were never going to satisfy what everyone wanted to know in one publication. So
For sure, and it's admirable that you guys did that. I think you've went about it the right way with this, because corners can be cut. It's very tempting to cut corners, and especially with transparency and stuff. And it brings me to the final, maybe opinion piece on your end. But when you're looking at validation studies, the conflict of interest word comes up a lot, and I'm wondering, what should practitioners be looking for with regards to conflict of interest? Because companies associate with researchers all the time, and it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
But what should a practitioner be aware of, or what should they be looking out for in that section?
Yeah, it is the nature of research, right? It's more and more becoming the way of things where commercial partners work with university partners, and that leads to a lot of great relationships, or a lot of great research gets done, and it's always going to be part of it. And I mean, it's kind of a lot of it's on the individual researchers and their mission, right? And their integrity and their track record.
Mm-hmm.
What's the reasons for doing these studies? You want to contribute to science, contribute to the field, and if it seems like people are wanting to do that, then you probably can trust the data they're putting out and the results they're putting out.
Yeah.
And I think if the data is there and is presented, and it's as transparent as possible, then you've got every reason to trust it. And that's where once again, it's better to almost just go straight and look at those results and not read too much on the interpretation of the authors.
Yeah. I put you on the spot there with that one. Don't worry. So the final thing I'm thinking on is, like you mentioned earlier, we were speaking, Gavin Lenton, yourself, and myself, on impact, and a lot of authors now are chasing impact with their universities and trying to tell the story of their research. How would you tell the story of these two papers if you had to give the Tyler spin on it?
Yeah. Well, if I sort of step back and look at my broader research and our team's research at Griffith University, we're interested in improving injury prevention, rehab, performance, and you can't understand in science things you can't measure. So part of what we have to do is establish valid, reliable ways of measuring things. And that involves, that's why we had a great partnership with VALD and using the field-based technology to get out there and get data and in a large scale setting when we're looking at injury screening, in particular ACL injury screening. Mm-hmm. But that also involves pushing the boundaries on what we can measure with human movement technology. I've used the human track a lot. We've got a reliability paper on the Microsoft Azure camera, which is the hardware behind the human track.
Yep.
And looking at how we can improve the motion tracking using skeletal models. And we found that by actually embedding a skeletal model, we can get slightly more reliable data compared to a normal analysis you might do with a depth camera like the human track.
Yeah.
So technology, being able to measure things, that's what unlocks the insight to then achieve these goals of enhancing injury prevention and rehab. And these validity and reliability studies are just part of that.
For sure.
That journey.
And I'm very, very cautious not to associate you as Tyler, the validator. There's a lot more that you're associated with as well. And you alluded to some of the AFLW stuff that you guys are working on, and actual real world sporting problems and sporting questions. So very cautious not to just say you're the validation guy, because you're much more than that. So I've got three it's kind of rapid fire. I always call them rapid fire. They never turn out to be rapid fire. So don't think too hard on them. But I just wanted to get your thought on three questions. So the first one is, what's the biggest myth you've encountered around validation studies?
Yeah. Okay. Biggest myth. I think there's always the way that people interpret data, which you could consider to be validity, which is, when you measure something and you associate it to something that is not necessarily measuring. So let's say you're doing your force sticks testing, and you see, peak forces are differing in some way, and then you attribute that to, it must be this muscle or this joint, and it's really not a measure of that. It's a more global measure.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say maybe the myth there is just over interpreting data and attributing it to things that are involved, but it's not a direct measure of those things. Maybe things like tendon stiffness or muscle stiffness. If you've got a really high peak force landing, well, that must mean the musculoskeletal structures are stiff.
Yeah.
So the over interpreting
For sure.
might be part of it, but it can't be the whole thing.
Exactly. I feel like you can definitely take the process of elimination with multiple metrics to highlight something, but you definitely can't just say this metric says this, so this is the problem. I've seen that a lot. Too much that or more than I would like to. Okay, so how do you ensure your research stays relevant to practitioners? I know sometimes in academia we can get sucked into just continuing down a certain track, and it may not actually be relevant. So how do you ensure that it stays relevant?
Yeah, good question. For me, I really enjoy talking to people that work in high performance sport. We have good ties with the Queensland Academy of Sport here in Brisbane, and it's talking to them and seeing the people on the ground and what their problems are. Industry, talking to the colleagues at VALD, they usually have their finger on the pulse more than anyone on what clients are after.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest, social media is pretty great as well. Like the amount that I've probably taken out of what people are talking about on social media helps frame what some of the problems are that are out there. And it just helps to trigger those moments where you go, well, you could do something here to try address these questions that people are discussing, and you can see where they don't have answers to those questions. So, I probably fuse all three of those together to try have a foot in each camp, which is industry, sports technology, and practical application, and then a foot in this other camp, which is the researchers and the engineers, colleagues of mine that we have at university. And I think the more I could bring those two camps together,
Mm-hmm.
I think good things happen in advancing the performance and injury field.
Awesome. And then the final one, what's next? What's the next research coming up, or the next topic of research, I guess?
Yeah, for me, I'm got two major arms of research at the moment, and one of them is injury screening, ACL injuries, integrating biomechanics into field-based screening for both assessing injury risk and identifying how to perform more targeted training interventions. So that's one side of my research. The other is quite biomechanics focused. I'm really interested in resistance training and looking at the forces in the muscles and tendons during resistance training exercises that we're able to estimate through computational models.
Mm-hmm.
So very keen for some of the research coming out that we'll have in the next 2 years around monitoring and prescribing based on muscle tendon loads, and then fusing that as well with the field-based technology to get measurements of muscle and tendon loading in a field-based setting to integrate with the injury screening.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So I feel like we're gonna have to get you back on, hopefully at the next VALDCon to dive into that and the findings of that. But that's really interesting.
That'd be great.
For sure. Cool. Well, Tyler, if people want to reach out to you off the back of this episode, what's the best way to do that? Is it on socials or is it email or?
Yeah. For email, you're about to find my Griffith Experts page. Has my email there and some of my work. I've been on X previously, but X is sort of academic X anyway, has sort of disappeared or Twitter, academic Twitter has disappeared.
Yeah.
I think LinkedIn seems to be where a lot of traffic is, while avoiding the Instagram crowd. I haven't quite jumped to that platform, but I know that's where.
Yeah.
So LinkedIn's the other place you can actually.
Okay, awesome, cool. Well, thank you so much for jumping on, talking about the research, and hopefully a lot of our listeners will take value from this conversation.
My pleasure, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
Amazing. And to our listeners, thanks for supporting VALDCAST. Don't forget to like and share the show on wherever you get your podcast. We'll be back very soon with another episode.